Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julia Boyd, Executive Director of the Atlanta Press Club, and thank you for joining us today. We're so pleased you are here for our virtual Gold Dome recap, where our panelists will unpack the 2025 legislative session. A big thank you to our friends at the Georgia First Amendment Foundation, who partner with us to bring you this program and our Gold Dome kickoff program every January. For more information about their amazing work, please visit gfaf.org and check out their legislative watch page, which will also be in the chat. For more information about the Atlanta Press Club, including membership options and upcoming events, please visit atlantapressclub.org. One upcoming event is next week and is our Award of Excellence event on Tuesday, April 29th at the Gathering Spot. You can find more information and register online. Now on to today's program. Please feel free to utilize that chat box as we will be talking about a lot of different issues throughout. So we'll take those questions as they come in. And I would like to welcome and thank all of our panelists. It's my pleasure to introduce Nora Benavidez, Legislative Committee Co-Chair for Georgia First Amendment Foundation and Senior Counsel at Free Press, Sarah Kallis, Politics Reporter at Georgia Public Broadcasting, and Mark Niesse, Government Reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Our moderator for today will be Rahul Bali, Politics Reporter at WABE and current Atlanta Press Club board member. Now I will turn it over to Rahul.
Thank you so much. And I think you used the key word there, unpack, because there's a lot to unpack from 40 days. People are like, how much gets done in 40 days? A lot gets done in 40 days. I remind people, it's hundreds of bills. You know, the three of us reporters, what do? We get to maybe a couple of dozen bills. There are hundreds of bills that are sent to the governor's desk, and even more that don't get anywhere. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's just get started. We had introductions already. Nora, let's just start with you. And when we were having our conversations before this panel, something interesting you said was there was less bills to do with the First Amendment, but that maybe I'll let you come up with a word. Was it more consequential, more in depth? There was just more to it.
Oh, well, thanks, Raul. It's great to be here with all of you. And thank you so much to our friends at the Atlanta Press Club. We partner with each other on these events all the time. And so I just love these. So few of us get excited about the legislative session. Certainly very few of us, even fewer, are there regularly. And so those that are, I think it's really fun to get together. And I think for the public, it's just so important to be able to understand and talk through what the legislative process really means for Georgians. So, Raul, as you said, we had our little pre-chat, and one of the things that I found interesting about this session was that there were actually almost half as many bills this year that our foundation, the Georgia First Amendment Foundation, was tracking compared to last session, for example. And yet, there is just such a breadth of bills within the First Amendment and the kinds of topics that you might consider. And so, in years past, we typically monitored bills that related to our open records law, government transparency, and pretty basic issues around freedom of the press or the right to protest or demonstrate. But it's 2025, and what we saw this year was just such a complex array of bills that implicated free expression and transparency. And so I won't go through all of those, but we monitored about 24 or so bills this year. By comparison, last year we monitored almost 50. So that's almost twice as many actually last year. And I know, Raul, will get into a little bit of the politics of why there are so many or so few on different calendar years. Within those 25 or so bills that we watched this year, we looked at so many different topics. There were, of course, our bread and butter issues around government transparency. There were issues around protest, schools and what can be taught, or books that can be accessed. And then this growing area of digital rights and AI and issues around the internet and our digital world. And that's really become, I think, one of the most interesting and growing areas where our work now is dealing with very novel issues around the First Amendment and around how people connect and make sense of the world in Georgia. So it's just become more and more complicated, more kernels of different types of issues related to expression, discrimination, due process, things that are now so far reaching. And so it's been a really exciting year. I'm excited to dig in together.
I find it interesting that you're talking about, the Georgia First Amendment Foundation, you think of free speech. You're talking about digital free speech. So can we talk about maybe one or two issues that you're looking at in that digital free speech area?
Sure. I think I want to start. There were about three or four bills that really dealt in some way with AI, artificially generated content, or in some other world, the digital frame of reference and definitions around speech. One of the most controversial and interesting, I think, this year was what many called the doxing bill. That was Senate Bill 27, and it added the crime of doxing to our stalking statute. That bill was one that we at the First Amendment Foundation monitored and were very outspoken about throughout the session. A number of entities and partners of ours wrote op-eds about this. I'll put some of those in the chat when I'm done here. And part of what we found, although it died, was that SB 27 was incredibly problematic and expanded what could constitute stalking in ways that were really troubling for the First Amendment. Just as another comparison for another bill that we saw related to AI and digital issues writ large was Senate Bill 9, which would have made it a felony to distribute, solicit, or possess with the intent to distribute AI generated obscene material depicting a child in any form, real or fictional. That text later was changed at the 11th hour to actually go back to a bill that we saw last session related to the offense of fraudulent election interference. And if someone creates or spreads or otherwise uploads materially deceptive media very close to an election period. And in the end, although that passed the Senate and the House in different iterations, it ultimately didn't pass in its final version that related to election and AI content. And then there were a couple of other bills, and it's so intense to go through what these bills are and where they stood and how far they went. But one other bill that we watched was Senate Bill 37 in the digital context. That was called the AI Accountability Act. And it really didn't get very far, but I name it because I think that we're going to see more and more of these issues crop up in the coming legislative sessions. And as we know, this year was the first of a 2-year session, which means any of the bills that didn't pass might rear their head again. So SB 37 would have required all governmental entities to develop and maintain an AI system usage plan. It was a really interesting bill. In many ways, people thought that it was an attempt to make more sense of and create kind of checks and balances for various commissions and other agencies in Georgia. There would be something called the Georgia Board for Artificial Intelligence, and various agencies would have to do a number of things related to that board. That really didn't get far as a piece of legislation, but we might see it again this coming year. And I'm eager for others. I know that so many of you tracked all of these bills. I think we're only going to see more and more proliferation related to digital speech, the ways that people get information online, and how we are actually thinking about regulating artificial intelligence.
Those of you just joining us, that was Nora Benavidez, talking about some of the things they're watching at the Georgia First Amendment Foundation. If you go to the chat right now, you'll see the legislative watch page for their organization. You mentioned elections, which is a perfect bridge to my friend Mark Niesse from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And one of the beats you're best known for is covering elections and voting in Georgia. Again, a number of bills, but it didn't seem like anything of consequence or major or actually anything at all passed. Mark, let's talk about elections and voting legislation from this past session.
Yes, this was the first year since 2020 when an elections bill did not pass the Georgia General Assembly. But certainly there was a lot of debate and discussion about it. The main bill that people were watching would have done a lot of different things. It would have withdrawn Georgia from this voter registration accuracy organization called ERIC, which has 24 states to compare when a voter has moved and then removed them from the voter list in their old state. Conservative critics of ERIC felt like it might be biased or felt like it wasn't accurate. Membership in ERIC has been politicized especially by Republicans who feel like it doesn't do a good enough job or might be slanted. But of course, it's also Republicans who tend to be most concerned about voter registration list accuracy. The bill also would have banned in-person drop-off of absentee ballots the weekend before Election Day. That became controversial in last fall's election when several counties opened up their election offices for people to return their absentee ballots in person. Conservatives, especially Republican Party members, objected to that. They felt like they were not given adequate notice of it. But as the courts found, it's clearly allowed in Georgia to return ballots in person. This bill would have banned it, but again, this bill didn't pass. And then there were also several measures related to the budget that would have funded items such as removing computer QR codes from ballots. These are the QR codes printed on ballots that contain your vote alongside the printed text, but this is the computer code that the scanners read. And it's in state law that they have to remove the QR codes, but the legislature did not appropriate any funding to do so. So I don't know how you can remove QR codes without the $66 million that the Secretary of State's office estimated it would cost. There also wasn't funding either for $15 million to update Georgia's voting machines to the latest version of Dominion software. That has been an election security desire from election advocates for several years. And now it looks like that's not going to happen before 2026. So where we're left is a whole bunch of nothing in elections. A lot of debate, a lot of discussion. There will be a study committee in the next few months that will look very broadly at Georgia's elections processes, procedures, and equipment, and that is very likely to result in legislation in the 2026 legislative session.
For those of you just joining us, this is the Georgia First Amendment Foundation and Atlanta Press Club wrap-up of the 2025 legislative session. If you've got questions, you can hit us in the Q&A or in the chat. We've talked about bills that did not make it. Let's talk about a bill that did make it. It has to do with in vitro fertilization. Sarah, let's talk about what we saw happen at the legislature this year around IVF.
Mm-hmm. So HB 428 passed both chambers this year with flying support. It essentially puts protections for in vitro fertilization or IVF into Georgia code. And so it's a pretty simple bill. It's a lot shorter than most that we see. That essentially says nothing in Georgia code can be construed to prohibit someone from accessing IVF. And what I really liked about this legislation is it was very personal to the sponsor. Representative Lehman Franklin sponsored the bill, and his wife was pregnant with their first child through IVF after years of battling infertility, trying with adoption and that falling through. And so he had a really compelling personal story. And as we saw debates over this issue pop up, we saw that a lot of lawmakers had a personal connection to the issue. And it was something that got a lot of support from both sides. And I think when there's so much division, it's kind of nice every now and then to see something that it seems like everyone can get behind.
And interestingly, I don't think we're done with this kind of legislation. A bill that you and I kind of noticed, kind of that, I don't know, was it 2 or 3 days left? A different piece of legislation that kind of mirrors that.
So there was another bill that dropped in the final days of the session that would protect access to contraceptives for women in Georgia. And it was pushed by several powerful Republican women. And so it had a Republican push behind it. And it shows that there might be some real movement on this. Now, it came up a little late in the session for it to be taken up this year, but since we're in, the first year of a biennium, next year we absolutely could see this.
Would love to start getting to some questions. So this first question comes from Blake Feldman, and this is for you, Nora. Going back to Senate Bill 27, and when we answer this question, remind our folks what Senate Bill 27, but his question is, Senate Bill 27 had a generic, quote, savings clause that provided protected free speech cannot be infringed by the anti-doxing law. Do you believe this gives courts do courts give boilerplate language like that have any weight when considering overbreadth challenge? You may have to explain the question as well, too.
Sure.
Remind people what the bill is, kind of explain the question, and then we'd love to hear your answer.
Sure. Well, first, I love the question. Anytime we can get into overbreadth or anything related to something as narrow as this, it's great. So SB 27 was a bill that ultimately didn't pass, but I think it's important for us to look at. This was considered the doxing bill. It would have added doxing, which is the sharing of specific and personal information, to the crime of stalking. And what the foundation, our Georgia First Amendment Foundation, felt was that it was flawed in a few ways. First, the breadth of the speech that would have been criminalized was so vast, encompassing rather inconsequential, even seemingly harmless information as a person's name or email address, and that all of that could be, folded into this crime of doxing unwittingly. There was also this issue around the mental state required to prosecute someone for doxing. And in this case, it was reckless disregard instead of specific intent. And so it really was just very, unfortunately, protective. And given the realities of how information gets shared, there were other problems with this bill. One of them, I think, in addition, was how oddly under-inclusive the statutory language was because it only applied to electronically transmitted speech. So if you're posting online potentially about someone else, that would carry different criminality and not be protected in the same way that something like distributing paper leaflets would be and wouldn't thus be subject to the doxing bill. Regarding the question of a savings clause, yes, there was one provision in SB 27, which was called a constitutional savings clause. And, it's sort of assumed that every statute will be applied in a manner that would harmonize with the Constitution. So the savings clause ultimately, I think, was rather reassuring, but only at first blush, kind of a superficial lip service to something. And ultimately, in practice, very not very useful. So just as one example, if something has like the brush that the courts could view as one thing, but ultimately in practice, it would really need to be applied in a different way. I think what we find, to answer your question specifically, is that the courts wouldn't be able to apply that boilerplate language with any real heft or rigor.
So let me hit a quick topic before we get back to our another round with our reporters. The state budget. It's one of the things I love to follow. There's a handful of us. Mark Niesse's colleague, Dave Wicker, follows the budget with me. We have some other what I would call budget geeks at the state capitol. An interesting thing that people always ask me right now, the last report on the state surplus put the surplus at $19 billion. We have state budgets that, the current state budget's at 40 billion, the next one's at 32 billion. So people always ask me about, hey, what happens with all that money? Sometimes it's asked in the context of federal Medicaid expansion. The explanation I give to a lot of people who ask me that question is understand that there's two dynamics when it comes to budget spending and budget writing. There's one-time expenses and there's ongoing expenses. What you see are budget writers, specifically Republican budget writers, who are more comfortable around the idea of one-time spends. For example, one-time school safety grants. For example, building a building on campus. Tax rebates that Governor Kemp signed last week that'll be hitting people's bank accounts in late May, early June. Versus the idea of long-term spending. You see a little less of that, and those things are done almost incrementally. So that's something that I love to answer on the budget, because people are always asking me, well, hey, there's all this money, what's going on? So that's probably one thing I did want to talk about. Is that something with the budget that happens a lot? Again, always going to see what happens with tax revenues. So the key three things I'm watching: tax revenues. They seem to be flat right now. Will those tax revenues be affected by tariffs? And you see a lowering of revenue going to the state. And of course, what happens at the federal level? Do you see cuts in federal funding coming to Georgia? And will there have to be adjustments in the budget? The big ones that people keep asking me about: cuts in federal funds for education and federal funds for Medicaid. Again, if you've got questions, you can hit us in the chat or the Q&A. Blake, thank you so much for your question. Nora, we're going to continue with you. Let's talk about another area. transparency. Like, what's going on? I mean, look, Mark, me, and Sarah, we come to the Capitol every day. Like, what's going on? Like, imagine a person who doesn't live the life that we do. Talk about some of the challenges you're seeing around openness and transparency in government in general, and maybe the legislature in specific.
Well, I'm so glad someone asked a question about open records, and I think the question I typed in answer was regarding FOIA, which is our, federal law. But our open records law in Georgia is one that our First Amendment Foundation is incredibly engaged on. I'll be honest, I could talk about transparency forever. Sometimes people don't find it the most exciting topic, and I just want to spend one moment explaining why it's so critical. I look at Mark, I look at Sarah, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here. But for those that are listening today, it feels as if intuitive that we should all have access to information that would implicate us, information about how Georgia agencies and our institutions and our elected officials operate, how they make decisions, their comings and goings, in any kind of official capacity. Those are the types of, information and data points that help everyday Georgians make decisions about their own everyday lives, what matters, how they feel about elected officials, what kind of support they're getting from their agencies here in the state. And yet, part of what's so troubling is that we've seen a real rise, not just in Georgia, but across the entire country, to winnow down, to narrow access to public records. That can be winnowing of journalistic access or the public access, or even just broadening exemptions to our open records laws across the country. And so I'm really interested in this topic, in part because what we're seeing when we see this rise in exemptions, it means that the public will have less and less of an idea of what's happening in Georgia and with our elected officials. So with that kind of context, there have been a number of bills this session that we monitored in what I very broadly call government transparency or open records buckets. And I'll rattle off a few names, and then I want to get into some of them. I know that others here are probably very interested as well. We saw one that was called Senate Bill 199. That would have changed Georgia's campaign and personal finance reporting system and adjusted how the State Ethics Commission handles complaints. It would also shield elected officials' addresses from the public. So again, kind of narrowing disclosures. It would change disclosures to 4 times a year instead of 6 times a year for our State Ethics Commission and others. Another bill that we saw, relatively low priority, but still one that we monitored, was House Bill 199, not Senate Bill, so House Bill 199. And that would have provided extra protections and provisions when it comes to personally identifiable information for judges and their spouses, and particularly removing the requirement for there to be a maintained database of protected persons, judges and their spouses, and the information about them. That would include their personal phone number and their addresses. So again, narrowing the information that might be more widely available. We saw another bill, Senate Bill 177, which fortunately died. That would have provided for transparency in foreign-funded political activities. It was a very odd bill. It would have required agents of what are defined as hostile foreign principles and foreign-supported political organizations to register with our State Ethics Commission. And it was a very odd bill. It defined hostile foreign countries as North Korea, Iran, China, and the Russian Federation. And it was a very odd one. It seemed like potentially high risk, but it really didn't move as far as we thought it might. Maybe it's a test bill. Maybe it'll rear its head again next session. All of those were bills that we monitored with, I'd say, quite a bit of rigor. The biggest one I want to talk about, though, is SB 12, Senate Bill 12, which at the beginning of our legislative session, the Georgia First Amendment Foundation was incredibly worried about. It would have allowed private organizations that hold contracts with a government agency to be excluded from open records requests here in Georgia. And that was really troubling because it felt like these were groups that were doing quasi-governmental and official activities with some kind of contract with the state, and yet they would have been exempt from any open records. And the open records request would have had to be sent to a public entity of some sort or a government agency, again, creating a kind of like odd barrier middleman to receiving open records requests by the public for anything regarding a private entity that conducted business with the government as such. And so we worked quite a bit throughout the session, particularly in January and February on SB 12. There was language that was amended in that bill, and ultimately it moved through the legislature, and we continued to monitor it, but we're far less troubled by its amended language. And so I know that that's kind of as a wrinkle within all of this, what I think you might be hearing is throughout the session, so many of these bills go through various iterations. And one of the kind of more meta concerns we have that we're always on guard for is how is our legislative session operating? Are we aware and is the public aware of how the process operates? Are there copies? Is there access digitally for everyday people to understand what new languages to bills when they get amended? And so we saw efforts at the very end of the session to amend the process and to make various aspects of our legislature, and particularly around legislative officials' communication with other branches, also exempt from the open records law. Luckily, that didn't pass. But again, these are just issues that over and over we have to be on guard for because they kind of can slip through without our noticing or without, frankly, any fanfare. And that's where we really play a critical role. We've been eager to be a constant presence at the Capitol.
Sorry, I muted myself. Before we get to the next thing, I do want to tip, look, we got great journalists from Georgia Public Broadcasting and from the AJC, but I do want to tip my cap to the state capitol reporters with the Associated Press and Georgia Recorder who noticed what was going on with Senate Bill 12 in that 11th hour, because they were some of the reporters to point that out for other reporters to notice what was going on. Real quick, before we get to some other bills, from Mark and Sarah, and let me start with Mark, talk about the challenges of finding and what we call a substitute bill or substitute language when we're tracking legislation. First, Mark, explain what that is and talk about the challenges that all three of us face as reporters to find changes that have been made to legislation on the fly.
That's a challenge, not just for us, but also for the public, right? How are you supposed to find a bill when it's going through these rapid late night alterations? So a substitute of a bill is basically when a bill is amended or updated. It's a new version of the bill. It's called a substitute. And Nora was just talking about Senate Bill 12. And what we saw is that through the Rules Committee is the gatekeeper before bills can come to the floor. They set this calendar, they set the agenda. So what we saw is a substitute to Senate Bill 12 that was presented to the Rules Committee. Now, you couldn't see this substitute online. You couldn't see this new version of the bill anywhere unless you were in the Rules Committee room in room 341 of the Georgia Capitol. If you had gone to the clerk's office and asked for the substitute, they would have said, no, we don't have it. So the only way to get it was to get it in that room. And this is the version of the bill that changed it very much, as Nora was saying. The new version of Senate Bill 12 would have exempted communications between the General Assembly and any executive branch agency, basically making all of those things not transparent. You wouldn't have been able to find out what goes into their conversations about the government that you and I pay for with our tax money. You wouldn't be able to know what they were doing behind closed doors. Whereas now you can file open records requests with agencies of the state to find out how much money they're spending, what programs they're working on, what they're trying to do either for Georgians or sometimes against Georgians, right? This would have been a shield for that bill. And so what I did is immediately after the Rules Committee left to go back into the House, I went in and tried to find a copy of the bill. And I did get a copy of Senate Bill 12, right? Sometimes the members of the House are handed copies of the bill in the committee meeting, but not to the public. You have to get a paper copy. And I was able to get my hands on that and make copies of it and share it with whoever asked for it, right? And so we could at least know what was going on. But it is not a transparent and open process when the Rules Committee is passing out a substitute of the bill that's up for a vote in the House of Representatives, but nobody can find it.
Sarah, I want to ask you both that question and combine it with another bill we want to talk about. School safety. In the aftermath of the shootings at Appalachia High School, you had the state legislature, on a generally bipartisan basis, pass a large package on school safety. But you know what? I remember a day, I think you were with us, we were chasing a substitute even on that bill. So first of all, talk about that legislation. And if you want to talk about, how we were even trying to figure out what was going on with substitute bills around that.
Sure. So the school safety bill, which is HB 268, it set up a variety of school safety measures for both elementary schools and secondary schools. And so some of those included school mapping for first responders and a statewide emergency alert system if there was a threat at a school. Then the more controversial part, the House version of the bill originally included a database that would transfer disciplinary records to other schools. In the final version of the bill, there was a way for school records to be transferred when a student transferred to another school district in a more timely manner. But in the House version, it had a database that would be a little bit more immediately accessible and it would have more information, especially concerning a disciplinary record. The Senate version of that bill stripped the database away from what was in the House version. And I remember there was some confusion from reporters and from other people who were following it. I mean, I remember a press gaggle afterwards when we had the bill in front of the Senate sponsor and we were asking him about specific sections of what was in the bill. And I think that was in a situation where the substitute it wasn't a totally different bill as we saw in some of what we call Franken bills where they're completely gutted and replaced. But there was a little bit of confusion as what the final version of the bill looked like. I think you're muted.
You'd think I'd be used to doing all these Zooms after all these years. There was the interesting moment where, as you referred to, Jeff Omey with the Associated Press just took the bill and put it right in front of a senator and says, "What does that mean?" So that was one of the more interesting moments of this session. I got to I'll for people to put a smile on their face, I got to tell you, one of my favorite Franken bills was a combination of making cornbread the state bread. It had something to do with sugar cane syrup, Brunswick stew, the official stew, and foreign adversaries having state contracts, all in one bill. That was probably, as you mentioned, Sarah, Franken bills. A very interesting conversation you and I had, Nora. By the way, if you've got a question, hit us in the chat or the Q&A. We'd love to take your questions. Again, you were talking about this is 2025 and we're thinking about AI and digital free speech. What is the right you and I have to our DNA, Nora?
I thought that Rahul might bring up the DNA bills because they were so interesting. And frankly, they were a bit of a surprise to me, and I think to others this session. There were two different bills that related to DNA collection. Let's just spend a minute talking about our biometric information, our DNA, other data about us. That's an odd area that sort of crosses a lot of different First Amendment issues. And the general presumption is that whether it's our phones and our ability to refuse opening our phones or other Fourth Amendment issues, there's also not just the First Amendment right to privacy, but there's the ability to refuse certain searches that our government might seek or ask of us. And DNA collection is this interesting and odd hybrid. I also didn't expect this to be an issue that our legislature would take up this year. So it was a surreal one. And there were two bills I just want to spend a moment talking about. One was Senate Bill 29, which died. It did not pass, but it would have expanded the scope of law enforcement DNA collection. And it would have included the collection of DNA samples from people arrested for felonies. And it would have redefined detention facilities to include more than is currently defined in this specific code section. And so the redefinition that would have been included was that detention facilities include any place of confinement for juvenile or adult individuals accused, convicted, or adjudicated for violating any laws. The law as it currently stands is that there is absolutely the presumption that detention facilities will collect people's DNA when they are charged and convicted of major crimes here in Georgia. But what Senate Bill 29, and then I'll talk about another one, did was expand the ability for law enforcement to collect DNA in a much wider ambit. And essentially, if you're just accused or arrested for a certain type of crime, there would be the ability for these facilities to collect your DNA. The other one, in addition to Senate Bill 29, was, hold on, I'm pulling this other one up. I'm so sorry. HB 125. I'm sorry that I named the wrong one. It's Senate Bill 166. And that one would have done something different, which is allow the collection of DNA from any individual in a detention facility that was just charged with a misdemeanor and subject to an immigration detainer notice. So again, expanding what is possible for DNA collection. All of this together, I think, poses a question, and a very odd one, about people who are protesting. And given what we've seen over the last several years with the arrest of individuals and charges for domestic terrorism around the Cop City and the large police detention facility creation. So my question for people is, if you knew that there was a law on the books regarding your DNA collection, and that you might have that collection if you're just arrested for a misdemeanor or another larger felony, would you go out and engage in some protected speech otherwise? I think that question might really change the calculus in how you answer it if you know that your DNA is going to be collected. And we live in this very, dare I say, almost like Minority Report moment where people aren't quite sure how their information is gathered. We know that, for example, our federal government has said it has begun monitoring the social media accounts of individuals. There's sort of this cloud of surveillance and a broader government apparatus that is looking at and, taking stock of people, our attitudes, our viewpoints, et cetera. And so it's against this backdrop that this DNA question and the set of bills tied to DNA collection cast a very odd note this session. Although both of them died, I am curious what's going to happen next session. And however they might be amended, what we're really seeing is governmental attempt here to further touch and sort of invade into our own privacy, our private data, our private biometric information, even our DNA. And so there's a lot to be seen when it comes to next session, how these might permeate or evolve. But they were both troubling examples that I thought could have implicated our free speech rights, changed the calculus for how people engage in their own protected speech, and have a very odd relationship to criminality, how different behaviors are criminal, and what detention facilities actually are defined as.
So I want to shift gears here to a topic that Sarah has been covering. That's around legislation aimed at transgender Georgians. Talk about some of the bills that you followed this session, some that made it, some that didn't. What were you covering in that space, Sarah?
Right. So by my count, there were 5 bills that sort of explicitly dealt with transgender Georgians. 2 of them are very similar. They dealt with transgender women in women's sports, from all the way from elementary school up to the collegiate level. And so the Senate version of the bill, SB 1, is the one that ended up crossing the finish line. The House version was essentially the same bill. It was just the House version. And so basically that requires participants in these school sports to participate in the sport based on their gender assigned at birth. And so effectively that would ban, especially transgender women, I think is who they were most worried about in women's sports. And so we saw that cross the finish line. There was a couple of Democrats that voted with the Republicans on that issue, but for the most part, it was party line. And then I think the more interesting response we saw was for SB 185, which dealt with transgender care for inmates in Georgia's prisons. So we know that only affects a couple of individuals. I think 5 was the number that was given during debates that are in the prison system that are receiving this care. And we saw in the Senate version of the bill, which was the first one that was voted on, we saw a couple of Democratic lawmakers break with their caucus and vote with the Republicans on this issue. The Democrats overall were opposed, except for these few. And then in the House, we saw a really interesting protest where House Democrats walked out during the vote in the debate on this. And so they weren't participating in the vote at all. They were out of the chamber. They were protesting. And overall, they opposed this legislation. Now, because the Republicans have such a majority in the House and the Senate, they don't need the Democrats' votes in order to pass this legislation. So that is headed to the governor's desk alongside the transgender sports bill. There were a couple of other bills that dealt with puberty blockers for minors and a bill that dealt with transgender care for employees of the state of Georgia on the state health plan that did not cross the finish line. Both of those passed the Senate and they were stalled in the House, but we could see that next year.
You know, Sarah, you mentioned that there was the walkout on that legislation. It was interesting. On a different bill, which I believe was the DEI bill, you saw Democrats in the Senate try to gum up the works. They did, a motion to table, a motion to adjourn, try to add 20 amendments to the bill. So you saw a different approach with Democrats. It's going to be interesting to see which of those approaches they take politically. I wanted to ask both Mark and Sarah a question about a group of people that both of you brought up in our conversations, and that's around folks who are developmentally or intellectually disabled. And Mark, you were following a bill that has to do with the death penalty. Talk about that.
That's right. This bill kind of flew under the radar, but it's pretty interesting and is designed to try to prevent people with intellectual disabilities from being put on Georgia's death row. And so what this bill would do is reduce the burden needed to prove in court that somebody has an intellectual disability in potential death penalty cases. So if you can show that you, a person defending themselves against a crime, that could warrant the death penalty in other cases, if you can show you have an intellectual disability, it'll be much, much less unlikely that you would get the death penalty and be subject to execution. This bill, House Bill 123, did pass. It is pending Governor Kemp's signature or veto, but in effect, this would, or at least it's meant to prevent intellectually disabled people from being executed or being sentenced to be executed in the future in Georgia. Georgia is one of 27 states that still has the death penalty, and this would constrain its usage.
And Sarah, you followed a bill that had to do with the minimum wage in this space.
Absolutely. So this bill would essentially require that employees with disabilities be paid minimum wage. And I think a lot of people were not sort of aware of the issue before it came up this legislative session. Now, I have to note this was a multi-year push, but it really got a lot more traction this year. And so it requires employers to end their participation in a federal program that allows them to pay employees with disabilities sometimes less than $1 an hour. And so this was another bill that had bipartisan support, and it cleared both chambers, and it's awaiting a signature at the governor's desk. This would affect about 250 people right now that are participating in these programs that are making very little money and would now be able to be paid minimum wage if the governor signs this.
You've heard it mentioned a couple of times here, both by Mark and Sarah. There are still hundreds of bills waiting for the governor's signature. He has till May 14th to sign all of those bills. No, May 4th or 14th. I'm blanking. I will double check that. The governor has 40 days, so that'd be May 14th. To sign those hundreds of bills. But a bill he did signed yesterday in a ceremony that brought many of the reporters back to the Capitol yesterday, was the signing of major changes to civil litigation in the state of Georgia. You've also heard it called tort reform. You've heard it called lawsuit reform. Look, the bottom line, and I think the important thing that I mentioned to people is that all of us are one incident away from either being sued or suing because you're involved in a tort. And you've seen a number of changes that have been made that are being made because of this. And what I'm going to be following as reporters, one of the arguments being made is by curbing large lawsuits and specifically the payouts. That's going to stabilize insurance rates. Some people even said lower insurance rates. That's something that I, as a reporter, and a number of reporters are going to be watching to see what happens with insurance premiums in the state of Georgia, connected to what this package went through. It's something definitely we're going to be watching. And you can see there's great reporting by the AJC, us, and GPB about what was in that bill and what's going to end up happening. I want to shift gears to Nora. We were talking about schools and a few minutes ago. And I mentioned the DEI legislation that you saw Democrats try to push on. Let's talk about libraries and schools and DEI. There were so many bills flying around this. Talk about some of the things that you were following, Nora.
Sure. Again, over the last several years, we've seen a rise in bills in some way implicating, what can be taught in schools, issues around students. And like Sarah said, some of those include, sports and transgender women. And then there were a few others this year. One of them that we watched, it was more of a low priority and it didn't pass, was House Bill 602, which would allow the denial of state funds for loans, grants, and scholarships for any student convicted of a criminal offense. There was also the DEI ban bill, which was Senate Bill 120. That also didn't pass. It would have required public schools, local education agencies, and public post-secondary institutions to not promote, support, or maintain any programs or activities that would advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then there was also another bill that we spent quite a bit of time on and we advocated heavily in opposition for, which was Senate Bill 74. And that was sort of the like library bill, as people often called it. That related to the sale or distribution of harmful materials to minors, and ultimately would have removed, if it had passed, criminal protections, which otherwise would have shielded librarians and other library workers if they sold, loaned, distributed, or otherwise exhibited in some way material that was harmful to minors. So we actually testified on this bill when it was in committee. We also have found over the years that this specific issue of giving harmful material to minors has reared its head multiple times. Last session, there were several bills that implicated these very questions. And I have to say, we always want to come to the legislative process and session able to support bills that are actually strengthening our open records law, expanding and protecting First Amendment rights. And so it's been sort of a troubling wrinkle within this session and the last several that we've had to oppose these various bills related to library and materials. In particular, part of what we were worried about is we've seen this in other states. We've seen bills that implicate library workers or expose them to criminal charges. And usually the problem is that these bills, and when they become law, often they've been challenged in other states. And they're just so overbroad. They create these large buckets of criminality where librarians are simply unable to assess the breadth of materials in their libraries. And there are so many different ways that someone can be considered a minor. The way one 7-year-old behaves and acts versus a different 7-year-old who might have older siblings and have a different set of maturity or questions. And then think of the person who's like 16 or 17 who is getting ready to go for college. Are they a minor in the same ways that other 7-year-old or the other 7-year-old I mentioned behave, and the kinds of materials that their family or their teacher or others might find offensive and harmful? So luckily that bill died, Senate Bill 74, but it's one that, again, we've just seen this issue over and over again. So I expect that over the coming sessions, we'll see these, knowing that this was the first of a 2-year session. Again, I feel like I've sort of been a broken record with that. We may ultimately see the library bills come back again.
I want to again shift gears to a bill that I know Sarah, me, and Mark all covered. And it was I'll tell you, one of the more interesting moments of this session was a filing of a bill to completely ban school zone traffic cameras. And I saw the bill and my head tilted. And I've tweeted a picture of that bill. I may retweet it. More than 100 lawmakers signed it. You had lawmakers like signing the sides and signing sideways, and it just showed the frustration around these cameras. Mark, talk more about the legislation and the fact that you had not just a bill banning them, you also had a bill reforming them. Both of them passed the House and got sent to the Senate. So let's talk about kind of, what was discussed, because it feels like everybody has an opinion about school zone traffic cameras.
Sure. I was thinking about the most dramatic moments of this legislative session, and I was thinking about traffic cameras. And when the Senate adjourned on April 4th early, and Chairman Alan Powell was still up there talking about the traffic camera bill, which now had no way of passing unless the House had agreed to the Senate version, because the House had its own version that would have required approval from the Senate. And since the Senate was gone, the bill basically died in the middle of its presentation of the bill that night a couple Fridays ago. But no, it was pretty dramatic, but that was not the most dramatic moment that I remembered. The scuffle with Senator Colton Moore. I remembered the Democrats walking out of the House. Those are up there for drama as well. But as you say, there were two bills, right, that passed the Senate and were pending in the House. One of them would have banned traffic cameras in school zones entirely, and the other that it seemed like the majority of the House favored would have had some regulations around the cameras. One idea that was in one of the bills would have put up flashing beacons with radar speed detectors 500 feet from school zones to warn drivers, so that it wasn't so much of what is perceived as a speed trap. And so both of these bills were alive and under consideration, but neither of them passed because the Senate adjourned and the House, by that point, what was the point of going forward? I think they did go forward and pass the bill, so it would be alive for the 2026 legislative session. But at that point, it had no chance of passing this year. And both of those bills are effectively stalled now.
You mentioned what happened with Colton Moore being arrested when he was trying to enter the House chamber. He's a senator from Northwest Georgia for Governor Kemp's State of the State address. And on the other end, what happened on the final night when you saw the Senate just suddenly adjourn while the House was still taking up some of their bills. And that brings up another important point that I talk to people about. We talk about Republican versus Democrat. We talk about urban, suburban, and rural dynamics. I think it's very important for those folks who are not at the Capitol every day. There is also the dynamic of House versus Senate. Even though both are controlled by Republicans, there is absolutely a dynamic and a difference in priorities. And I think you mentioned what was going on with the traffic camera bill. I think another bill that kind of fell into that I followed was Senate Bill 244. It was a combination of a Senate Republican priority, which was legislation that would allow President Donald Trump and his co-defendants in the election interference case to be reimbursed their legal fees. So that was a Senate priority legislation. That ended up getting combined with a bipartisan priority of overhauling the system of compensating the wrongfully convicted in Georgia. Right now, that process is, if someone is wrongfully convicted, there's an individual piece of legislation that gets filed with the person's name and how much money, but none of those have passed since 2022. So this legislation that was, again, bipartisan in nature, you saw it from State Representative Scott Holcomb, who's a Democrat, and Republican State Representative Katie Dempsey, produces an expert panel. They review the cases. It would come out to $75,000 a year. Those two bills ended up getting combined just so a House priority and a Senate priority would get across the line. But there was a lot of frustration, especially from Democrats, that these two bills ended up being the bills combined. So I try to remind people that dynamic is absolutely out there. Couple of other bills and a couple other things I want to talk about. Mark, another one of your beats, something that you and I both cover quite a bit, is around medical cannabis. and THC products in Georgia. Talk about some of your reporting there. And real quick, folks, we've got 5 minutes left. So if you got questions, drop those in the chat and the Q&A, and we'll hit those. Talk about some of the bills that you and I were following there.
So there were at least 3 bills that cleared the Senate. Some of them would have increased or decreased the THC content allowed in CBD products, such as Delta 8 is a fairly popular one. Another bill would have increased the percent of THC allowed in medical marijuana products for registered patients in the state. When these bills got to the House side, the one that was moving forward would have entirely banned THC-infused beverages, which are a growing market in Georgia and across the country. It would have been an outright ban on putting any hemp-derived chemicals into beverages. And so that bill was amended again in the House to allow THC beverages and also allow them to be sold not just in CBD stores and gas stations and convenience stores, but also by liquor stores, which are much more regulated than those other businesses. But even that bill did not pass. It just never came up for debate after it cleared the committee. And where that leaves us is that CBD and THC products are in the same place where they were going into the session, which is after a bill passed in 2024, they are more regulated. There are age requirements and ID checks to be over 21. There is laboratory testing, and there are some other consumer protections involved in that, but no expansion or contraction of CBD or marijuana in Georgia, at least until next year.
I'd love to wrap up with our, our amazing guest here. Right now, from now until May 14th, we're going to be watching bill signings. We're going to be watching vetoes. But after that, Nora, what are you watching from now until we come back to the state capitol in early January? What are the things that you're going to be following? The same question are coming for Sarah and Mark. What are you watching from here till the end of the year until we get back to the other half of this General Assembly?
Sure. Well, 2026 is going to be a big year. And before we get there, we will, of course, be monitoring what the governor signs, what he doesn't sign. We only have a few weeks left for that deadline. I also think that the off period between sessions is a really interesting one for conversation with members and to take a pulse of what they found, where their priorities were. There are tremendous allies that we have at the Capitol, those members that are eager to protect the First Amendment, eager to protect open records and our open records law here in Georgia, and to do a little bit of the legwork before and around the legislative session that starts up again in January. And that sort of gets us to, Rahul, what you, I think, have been very elegantly flicking at, that, this is a 2-year session. And it means that next year may very well feel more chaotic. It may feel more full. There may be more volume of bills that get introduced, that move quickly. I often feel that that second year in our 2-year sessions are somehow just more packed. By the end of those, I feel like I have not just run some kind of marathon, but I've done a triathlon. I don't know. I'm not much of a sports person, so I don't want to make too many sports metaphors here. But I just feel more tired at the end of those. And I'm so curious if others do as well. It's like we've survived a lot. And so what we'll be doing is just prepping the list of bills that we know might rear their head again, those bills that didn't fully pass this year but are concerning. And I'm also eager to see if there are ways that we can move proactive agendas, ways to really protect those open records and First Amendment rights that we have. Anecdotally, and I'll close with this, over the last 5 years, we've seen over 1,000 bills across the entire country that have been introduced in some way implicating the First Amendment and free expression. That's across the whole country. And I've seen that the number just seems to pretty steadily be going up every year, more or less. And so I think that issues around speech, expression, and certainly the digital realm will only become more and more relevant. And part of our job at the First Amendment Amendment Foundation and more broadly those that are advocating for basic rights is to help educate the public, help bring people into why these issues matter and why it's important for people to engage in the process themselves. You know, democracy is something we have to engage in every day. So I'm really eager for next session and really grateful for the time together.
We got about a minute and a half to wrap up. Sarah, what are you following? We're going to hit this will be the speed round. Sarah, what are you following from now until next year?
Bill signings, as you said, you know, we can take a look at the laws that go into effect and how they're affecting communities, which is one of my favorite parts of this job. And then, I mean, we're already starting to see the beginnings of the 2026 campaign cycle. So we'll be back to that sooner rather than later.
Mark, what are you following from now until the end of this year and then into the next session?
I'm very interested in the work that will be done in the off session, these study committees. You know, that there's a big one dealing with elections that is intended to be very comprehensive, right? Looking at our voting technology, looking at our voting laws, looking at the role of the state election board and voter list maintenance and management and voter challenges. It seems like so much will be on the table when legislators get together and try to create a plan for what to do in 2026, which will be challenging, right? It's hard to pass complicated laws that deal with voters' rights and the act of democracy at the same time when who knows how many state legislators, senators, and representatives are campaigning for higher office, right? They'll all be trying to make a name for themselves in an election year. And you don't always make a name for yourself with the most nuanced and well thought out legislation. Sometimes you do it by having the most blunt instrument available. So that is something for voters to look out for.
I'm going to do this real quick. I'm going to be watching the implementation of the school safety legislation, implementation of tort reform. And we got a last second question from Phil Lunny. Phil Lunny, how will those who have declared to run for a different role in 2026 affect the second year of session? I think we're already seeing that. There were a couple of times sitting in the back of the Senate where we went, those two are going to run against each other while they're, questioning each other in the well. Look, you're going to get a bunch of announcements, and then let's watch what legislation those folks are either already pushing or will push in the next session. Hey, folks, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the Atlanta Press Club. Thank you to the Georgia First Amendment Foundation. Thank you to Sarah, Nora, and Mark. Y'all, best thing you can do is either follow our work or even subscribe or support the work of Georgia Public Broadcasting, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, WABE, and the Georgia First Amendment Foundation. Thank you to everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day.